podcast listeners, if you hear my voice right now, I need you to do something for me. I want you to take out your phone or on your computer, go to Apple Podcasts, search for Ask Your Oldhead Podcast. You'll see my logo, my little picture, my little image there. Find the show. Please rate and write a review. It's a small thing, but it helps others find this work and find what I'm doing here. And it really, really matters, as small as that may seem. So if you could please do that before we get into the show, I would much appreciate it. Thank you for listening. Let's get into it. Peace. You are listening to Good Brothers. Let's get into the show. Peace. I'm Majestic.
My brother, Justice Rajee, what's happening, man?
Oh, I mean, scratching and surviving.
That's right. Hanging in the child line.
Which I never knew what they were saying for years.
Yeah, we had no idea. Like, hanging in the child line.
Yeah, because it was such a strong way they came out when they said it. It was like, hanging. Good time.
Right.
Just keep going.
Right.
Like,
they was like hanging in the jungle. Yeah, hanging in the jungle.
Right. The only thing you could do is just watch the next episode and try to listen again because there was no replay, was no DVRs, was none of that. So you just had to like, and this one thing you just go, it probably don't matter that much anyway.
But you kept thinking that it was the same thing because once you thought, it's like the human, the brain, right, with bias, right? Mm-hmm. Once you thought what you heard, then you just keep hearing the same thing, even though they're clearly never saying what you think they're saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's something there. Anyway.
Yeah, most definitely. So, this week, I guess it's the part 2, but to most of the world, it will be a part 1. Although, I think I might put the other part of the part 1 as a bonus material for those on.
Hey, that's right. For folks that's behind the paywall.
So knowledge, Molly, Sarah, Supreme, all 4 of y'all get to listen to the other part. But anyway, peace to them. So 2 things, in the midst of everything else that's happening in the world. David Dinkins passed. I guess at this point it was last week. Yeah, Monday. And then there was also Obama released, his new book, which I haven't been able to read yet, obviously, because I got other books. I got a backlog of books. But there was a Breakfast Club interview with him, and there was a relationship between these 2 things that I thought was something interesting. And so we'll fast forward in with Dinkins, and I think the one thing between them is the perception of Black elected officials. And now the mayor of New York City and the president of the United States are 2 vastly separate things, but they're also things that in their uniqueness that, being the mayor of one of the largest city in the United States and one of the financial capitals of the world is no small feat, right? We might.
Well, I mean, one thing. Rahm Emanuel often said this, which I'm sure there's a percentage of people that said, "Oh, did you say his name? I hate him." But he said that there are 3 people who, by the nature of what they lead, are closest to running the United States: the mayor of New York City, the mayor of Chicago, and the governor of California.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the populations they're dealing with, the sheer amount of space, the business interests, like all those kind of things, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, California is really kind of like if you would look at it, it's kind of like its own country, right? Unto itself, with the populations of people. You got the people of Jefferson that want to succeed, right? You got Staten Island that wants to succeed. So like, you got like these parts. So I just think the sheer scale of being the mayor of New York and accomplishing that goal, and the sheer scale of being the president, is also another link.
Yeah. And I guess the thread that I wanted us to pick up on, or I mean, you can. One of the salient things I just remember about the David Dinkins era was feeling like before it even got going, I was being encouraged to think of it as not going well. Even though I was like, did he just get elected? Like, how could it go bad so fast? Like he just got there, right? And then,
man, that's the biggest hit job, man. Like, I mean, in retrospect, the hit job of the post. I mean, but that's, when you really even look at like a piece of art that was happening at the same time of Jungle Fever, you just really think about what was occurring, Do the Right Thing and going into Jungle Fever, right? Like New York newspapers were openly racist.
Yeah. Without question.
Right? Like they were openly racist and they were allowed to function as that. So to your point, like a guy that failed before he ever succeeded. I think that, the media, as well as our own media in this time, had everything to do with that. So I agree.
And so, and I always think it's important to elevate it's fair to be critical of people's performance, but I think when we be critical, we want to be specific. And then also to elevate, like, there's also the circumstances and conditions under which someone, had to do something. And to note, being the first and only black mayor of New York City. And then when we get to, Barack, the first and only black president of the United States,
right.
There is something to be considerate of the entire scope of the American experience, as it were. What's something?
Well, it's fair. It's fair to be critical, but it's also critical to be fair. And I think that that's a challenge that our media is, and then how we start to understand the job of an elected official while it's happening, and then after. Right? Because there's two parts to that. So, I mean, a thing that I recall that was interesting, one, and I think, again, a through line to this conversation, are the relationship to two people that both of them had a really interesting relationship to, Donald Trump and Jesse Jackson. Now, for all the listeners, the relationship with Jesse Jackson is the campaign of 84 and more importantly, 88 for president. And again, history, sometimes we can forget about it because Barack Obama won. So we forget that like Jesse Jackson came from being with Dr. King and running the Rainbow Coalition to next thing you know, going to Palestine, negotiating with the PLO, and then running for president in 84, kind of shocking the world. In 88, actually heralding the vast majority of people who are still in government who came to be known as power players, right? Came from the Jackson administration, came from the Jackson races, right? Ron Brown, person I talk about a lot, but then also the book, if anyone wants to check it out, just you can share the link, for colored girls who were into politics. A lot of those sisters, including Tina Flory, who now is the chief of staff to Kamala Harris, just to show you the through line, right? Got their start with the Jackson campaign. So the role of Jesse Jackson and the creating the kind of like buzz, even for David Dinkins to win in 89 in New York, as well as a whole host of other mayors who everybody behind the paywall on Patreons, we're going to get the rest of y'all behind there. Y'all can hear all the other shit we talked about. But then also, obviously, through line to Jesse Jackson and in the complicated relationship between Jesse Jackson and Barack Obama, but then also Donald Trump, right? And the role of Donald Trump as, to your point, financial capital, rich person keeps not paying his debts, whoop-de-whoop, fostering the kind of space of late 80s, early 90s New York, which we came to know, and that beginning of the personality of Donald Trump, which had its origin story there, and then clearly Barack Obama. But also one of the big things I'll say that stood out was about this through line we're talking about. But I saw about David Dinkins, but then the through line was two things. One, the coalition that David Dinkins put together of like Black folks, brown folks, Black and Latino folks. At some point, we got to have this conversation about Latinx but it's only in the challenge with, some of the stuff going on with that. But Black folks, Latino folks, a variety of perspectives, and then white folks from the Upper West Side, right, that voted for David Dinkins. And then two, that he was a statesman, right? And, Black electeds often have to be like, not just good policy folks, they have to be like statesmen. They have to speak really well. They have to look really good, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And how Dinkins, that was what got him there. But then again, when the press turned on him and all this stuff started happening, then that same thing is used against him, which I think becomes a through line to Obama as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think the idea that, like, we could frame this moment, it's almost, in some ways, it's like, hey, how didn't we see this as the two existing figures in American political history that could possibly rise as the counter note to a Black, executive official, this time, first time being a mayor, second time being a president, be Donald Trump, and then and apparently his man's Rudy Giuliani, right? And you understand that, right? Like, we didn't like looking back at it, I'm like, I saw it, I knew it would be somebody, it would be a wild one after Barack, because I knew enough about America, and I'm like, yeah, they're gonna pick the wildest dude they could find, right? And people are like, no, they're gonna get like a sensible, career. No. There was never a sensible career Republican who was gonna be able to follow and beat whoever followed Obama, because if it was someone that someone could talk themselves into, someone that maybe who sits in the wherever, I guess our center right, a lot of times is like the center now, but whatever the case, that we'll get into political philosophy, but we're not going to do that too deep. However, it was a whole bunch of mushy mouth mashed potatoes, folks they threw. It was 14, 15 of them, but all of them was like the same mashed potatoes, some with more butter, some with more olive oil. But it wasn't it wasn't like, ooh, it was like, nah, none of these people are wacky enough. You need somebody further, right? And someone who really, although perceived by, who in a tabloid sense he hobnobbed with, or appeared to hobnob with, or appeared to fund, ultimately hasn't really changed anything about their, political philosophy, which is the philosophy of what I want, right? And real estate interests. What I want and real estate interests. That's that man's bag, and that was his bag then. And then was whatever way to ingratiate yourself, within the media sphere. And the the Giuliani's campaign following Dinkins and all that was all around this stuff on crime and all the platitudes of like of the he's not strong enough on this, like all the ways that you sort of in any other setting you say a Black man gets in that sort of position, and you would go like, he can't be publicly aggressive in the way a white man in the same position could be, because it's not going to play, and especially not in the 90s, right? So, that's just one thought, though, just how that kind of nobody.
Well, I mean, to your
point,
I think to your point, and just to quickly add on regarding that, like, so you get 89 where Dinkins barely beats Giuliani, you get 93 where, because of the perception that New York is out of control, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was largely perception.
Yeah.
That you need Giuliani, you need the tough guy, right? And just like the paint or whatever was on his head was being sweated off, we got to remember that Giuliani was up for a minute, but then constantly being seen as like not the person for the time until 9/11 hits, right?
Right.
And then 9/11 hits, he's America's mayor, and then he goes on to just access his crazy in a deeper and deeper way until we get to the Four Seasons issue in Philadelphia, right? And so I think it's interesting when we think about the, Dinkins leaves, goes to work at Columbia, mentors people, does work in the city, continues to be a citizen of this town that he loved. But shout out to him being from Trenton.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Takes, baby.
Takes. You know what I mean? Central Jersey's finest. So like, he continues to be a statesman, going back to his point about Obama. And Giuliani becomes a moron, right? And so, you know, but we allow white men to be that, right? The black man, even post having one of the most important municipal jobs in the world, still has to be on top of his game. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump right now is becoming unhinged, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a segment of the GOP and the Republican Party that is normalizing his unhinged behavior. Yeah. It's almost like if Bishop and Juice had like people that really was backing him being Bishop. You know what I mean? Like Bishop didn't have nobody backing him. He just was Bishop on his own. Right. But imagine if Bishop if like Q and my man Jermaine or whatever his name was, I forget whether. Oh, yeah. But basically, Huggy or Jermaine, the black name out the 90s. So like, you know, like he has hijacked that entire party, or maybe revealed who that entire party is, depending on how you want to look at it. But just those two different divergent paths, I think, is a really interesting way to look at the role of the roles and the possibilities of black men and white men, and the space that you have on the spectrum to be who you are. So yeah. I mean, you know,
and just so that it's said, I have no interest in necessarily being, you know, a one-sided, a single vision, one-eyed cyclops, as a great elder of mine once said. You know what I'm saying? Don't turn it to. I don't want to be the cyclops. You know what I mean? However, you know, as an example of the way our society will basically adjust and go, well, you know, just sometimes some guys are cyclopses. That's just how it is. It's like, no, man, cyclops, man. We don't want cyclops here. Like, you don't get to be cyclops. Like, we need to publicly scorn you for being cyclops. You know what I mean? And not just in like a more, I don't know, a more intense way, a more serious way, not in a way that's easily dismissible. But I know, you know, shame only goes so far as a construct. So, you know, also you got to recognize the limits of that. You know, but I think that the other thing that having some time to dwell on this, and I want to, you know, maybe fast forward in our clock a little bit, but I wanted to get to was, and it's something that Dinkins exhibited and that Obama shared, I thought was a prominent thing, you know, in within that question of like doing enough for black people, you know, construct, right? We could circle back to some of the other points of both of them, but that, you know, the perception that any elected official in their role, and this is not saying they don't need to have policy concepts and in some places maybe have very specific things, you know, that are very specific about black people, but the idea that for black people, it is a useful analysis tool to go, what did you do specifically for black people? And damn anything else. Like, I don't know if it, like, I want us to get to the place with that conversation where we can analyze, like, all right, like, one, if something is a good policy, it should, you know, it should do well for the person's most harmed, right? And in that case, if that's black people, you know, or, you know, depending on what it is, or, you know, if you're trying to relieve harm, some policies aren't necessarily about relieving harm. They're about other things that may cause harm. So, you know, I wanted to add that caveat too. But like the sort of, because I mean, I remember New York in the early 90s versus New York when I went there as a kid in the 80s, and it was different. New York was different. Whether that was Dinkins' responsibility, like whoever made it different, I remember it being like, yeah, it feels different. Felt a little more tense back in '86.
Scary hours.
You know what I'm saying? Versus how it felt in '92.
Yeah, scary hours.
You know what I'm saying? Sure. Not that it was out of the weeds by any stretch of the words, or even, you know, depending on how you're situated in circumstances, that you're out of the weeds now. But, you know, the city was different. And I worry sometimes that we get into a place where we're not critiquing people on terms that are reasonable or that we can learn from them, right? So we're going, oh, well, the reason I brought that up because both of them sort of, Obama articulated very well in the interview. Like, look, you're gonna win across the entire country. You gotta talk about these things. I can't just talk to y'all, and I can't, and policies can't just be about like us because although we are large in population in certain areas, a lot of places where we're not. Doesn't mean that our needs aren't important. Doesn't mean that our issues don't need to be met. But it means the way you get to the policy structure and the conversation, you got to wrestle with other people's ideas, and the way you talk about it or the way it even is structured may not, I don't know, it may not look or taste the way we want it to taste. You know what I'm saying? And I wonder. Yeah, I'm
so no. So point, first, just no. I think you I think you framed it in an amazing way, as you have the ability to do. I think there's two things about that I think we can use from Dinkins and then kind of shift to the Obama interview, if you will, which I think is a big part of what he was saying. What you're saying was a big part of it. Elected officials win by coalitions. And especially if you're talking about a country or a city like New York, right? Because Black folks in Brooklyn have sometimes different interests, even down to the different ethnic or country of origin conversations, right? In New York City, I mean, it was a little more homogenous then, but the quote unquote Latino population is just like it is in America. You have Mexicans, Guatemalans, Venezuelans, you know what I mean? Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Cubans, who are all on different forms of the spectrum of what it means to do something for them. Black folks are in all different parts of the spectrum of what it means to do something for us, right? But you have to put these coalitions together, usually to fight the arch and ardently revisionist, revanchist, and fascist forces in a city or in a country. And so you then have to promise to some degree, here's what you're going to do. And then you have to look at the landscape of the other elected officials who could be Black who aren't going to help you, who could be white who aren't going to help you, who could be Latino who aren't going to help you do those things because they have different interests. Politics is the resolution of interest in a scarce space of resources and time and ideas, right? And so often because we're coming out this model of there can only be one and one will take us to salvation, right? And if you think about this from a context of not just the civil rights movement, but the particular, what I'm going to call religious elements of the civil rights movement, because there's parts of the civil rights movement that were actually totally coalition-based politics, right? When SNCC and different groups in SCLC and folks are doing their work, they're doing coalition work, right? People's perception of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., people's perspective of Malcolm X, right? People's perspective of Adam Clayton Powell, right? Those things were all messiahistic political perspectives. This one person's going to lead us to the promised land. And that shifted over to politics. And some folks gladly played the role of this is about me, right? So we talk about Harold Washington a lot. You look at what happened in Philadelphia with Wilson Goode, even though that was 15 or 20 years of Black folks creating coalitions and pressuring white folks, pressuring different communities, organizing our own communities who did not get along. Because just like I said in New York, West Philly and North Philly, West Philly and Uptown, Southwest, everyone didn't have the same interests all the time. So you take this coalition work, but then you put it on one person. That one person could never have solved the problem. And then we say, you failed. And then we go look for another person who will solve the problem. So it's a lack of political sophistication that we do when we think one person can do this or don't understand the nature of politics, as sometimes distasteful as it is, right? But that's the reality of it. You create coalitions and you create leverage points, you create power positions. That's what you have to do. That is a long-term project, right? Just like I always say, white supremacy is a long-term project. Building Black power, making sure that people are thinking and making sure that Black folks are involved in things that better themselves and involved in every decision. That is a long-term project. That is not a microwave project. So I'll stop. I don't want to go, but I think Dinkins was an example because you didn't get a turkey in every pot. You assume he didn't do things for Black people, or because of what you perceive. Now, Dinkins, I'll use this and I'll stop. It is now recorded that Dinkins started the process of building tens of thousands of units of affordable housing or maintaining those units for Black folks in New York City, right? Which obviously now New York is one of the few places, or parts of New York in particular, one of the few places that you can't really get rid of everybody Black.
Yeah.
Right? Like you kind of can't. People can choose to move and people can choose to go to different parts of New York. But generally speaking, you can't get rid of Black folks in New York. The buildings is too high. You ain't got nowhere else to send them. Yeah. Right? So, the conversations you're having about Chicago and the population loss, the Black population loss in Chicago, the Black population loss in Oakland, the Black population loss in all these cities. If you notice, you don't have that conversation of the entire city of New York and the population loss, except people who wanted to go somewhere else. Dinkins had a lot to do with that. If you consider that doing something for Black people, then you're wrong because he did. But if you consider, did he make everybody Black a millionaire? Did he stop the police from kicking our asses? No. Okay, then he didn't. But that's my point. When we say, what did you do for Black people? It presupposes that there is a Black agenda.
Right. That
isn't encompassing enough.
Right. And is clear in the context that the majority of us actually agree on what it is and how it works.
Right.
Because I think even I think, let me say this, I think it's a good thing for Black people with divergent political policy ideas to actually talk to each other and to engage with each other to go, so we know what things we don't, hey, I think we both might want more homeowners, but some of us may think we need to do it through, increasing certain loans to banks or some people no,
right.
we need to do individual development accounts, right? You can have this same idea that, property ownership is the vehicle, but then how do we get people to the property ownership turns into this whole other discussion, right? And then, it gets into other values, right, that people have.
Or CLTs. Just to add on to your point, or someone could say, I don't like the fact that somebody could just sell their house for so much money when the public helped them buy their house. So you should have a limited amount to sell your house. But the other Black folks would be like, hold on now, this deep in the game, when white folks don't use the system to build wealth, now you want to stop Black folks from building wealth.
Right.
Now you want to live.
You want my opportunity to buy into the American cash cow real estate at the limited capped structure,
right.
Not the structure that I have the opportunity either for, in some cases, ridiculous inflation, where it's man, you got that much for that place? Yeah, because right now that's what they're going for. They hot right now. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
This other number right now. And I'm not here to make a judgment decision about that, but that's the question I think that we have to wrestle with when we talk about these different policies or positions, right? And then especially in a place like New York, and in general in realities of how cities work, and that there's no more space available necessarily outside of converting something that wasn't space into space, right? That's
right.
What space is made, creating space, capping highways, or changing something that was a rail yard, or that used to be some other industrial thing, and now we can do this, we can cap it in cement, and we can do this other thing to it. Now you can live on it, right? These proximity is still a thing that matters, and then it gets into the conversation of what's the you can get into deeper conversation about suburbs and structures and maybe other places should be dense, and that gets into transit conversations, but we're not going to go there right now.
Right.
The general,
but it's all part of values.
Right.
I guess my point is all part of values, and we have to have the conversation about the values. And I think sometimes we assume that there's shared values.
Yeah. And I think what I'm pushing us to is because I think as maybe a cap point on this whole election season's conversation about Black men and our politics, right, and how we vote or don't vote or what we believe in or don't believe in. I think that there's a like a criticism I always hear of Obama is his insistence, and I think he's always right or the right timing with it on his kind of your individual activity. Like when people ask him about doing stuff, it's like, well, Obama, what do you think I should do? It's like, well, brother, we need you to do it, right?
Right.
And part of that though to me is that's Obama, the organizer's thinking. Is right. I'm always recruiting someone to get into the work. I'm not necessarily trying to I'm not trying to explain to you some other systemic response, and I'm trying to get you to jump in, right? Like that's how I read it. Now maybe he's not. Maybe Obama really only thinks that people are individually responsible for their outcomes, and therefore if it's not working for them, it's their fault, which I don't think is true, and we know that's not true. But that's what some of us will imply because of the public statements that he makes, especially our more critical. Further, probably to the left, so to speak, of me, individuals will be like, yeah, he never indicts the systemic realities of the thing. And I'm like, yeah, because do you want to hear about the systemic realities if I ask you a personal question?
Well, no. That's what they'll tell you. But I think that they will use that. And again, that's a value. That's a place where people exist on the spectrum, right? Mm-hmm. I think your point...
Well, and I got that when it gets to me thinking about David Dinkins, and I guess something that has bristled me is that, I generally don't trust, media entities, especially as a young person. I'm like, if they all think he's bad, he must have been good.
Good. That's right.
Right. Because they all talk about him like he's bad, like he's his name in and of itself is a 4-letter word and an indicator, of some sort of something that could have been, either. I mean, for Dinkins, it was always pretty much that he was not good at all. For Obama, it's, well, now everyone loves him. I mean, certainly things always love him because he's Obama and he talks nice and he seems like a generally cool, seems like a legitimately cool dude. Like if you kicked it with him, seems like maybe he's not, maybe he is. I don't know. Right. And the parent idea that he is known to have sort of a potty mouth away from the camera, which means that he intentionally works on not talking, with the extra profanities when he's not on mic, which means it's probably if you're off mic with Obama, he probably says some things that are pretty entertaining. I would imagine, just my history with people that could use a good, that have good skill with their profanity. They tend to have funny things to say when they know that it's right time to say it. So say that. But when we are trying to use the past, thinking about from an electoral thing, right? And you're trying to get Black men, you supposedly want to get Black men energized around, your policy position. And that the none of the, but also doing it as if we don't see the way you talk about it, which is that we don't see the way that Black men are talked about once they assume a leadership role, like what happens to them, what's said about them, if it doesn't go well, or if it does go well, but people don't like it, or whatever the case may be, or if they, for whatever reason, fall out of some place of favor. And though, so I want to how do we make sure we are finding a useful actual, critique, right? And then also accepting that you might not like, I don't like every the policy decision and leadership decision Obama made, nor did, or probably if I was, older and able to pay attention closely, that Dinkins made. But largely, I don't see either one as a failure in the work that they set out to do. And I see more of the value in going, and I think even you spoke to, the importance when someone like that runs for office, and this goes for any large office and national position that Black people run for in, across the spectrum, is that you usually bring other people into the business, so to speak. You bring them into the game, they get experience, serving in the work of somebody that they actually, could rock with and may actually be more responsive, right? And so there's a value when, on that high level and on the lower level and the smaller levels when someone runs for a position and then who rolls with them, who's in the crew. You know what I'm saying? And that you build these other, this other capacity to do what? Build other things and not just run for office. Office is just part of it. But so that's my thought that I needed to
No, I mean, no. I think you make some amazing points. I think in just a quick response and add on to what you're saying. And I'll take your first point, your last point first, and then go back to the other ones. When we think about de Blasio and his wife and so many people who had their start in politics, they came from working with Dinkins, right? They came from working with Dinkins because Dinkins was dedicated to creating a coalition of people to be able to build power and have people do the right things in government. Mm-hmm. When someone gets to start in your system and becomes the mayor of New York City 20 years later after, or almost 25 years later after you were successful. You know what I mean? Because if you're alive long enough, that means you pick up the phone and call that person and say, hey, I need you to do this, right? Right. So, and when you're talking about building, again, long-term power, when you look at the Heritage Foundation, right, and the leadership they did to identify judges, to identify leaders. I'm reading the book on Jim Baker. Jim Baker recruited Ted Cruz and Neil Gorsuch to work on the 2000 recount in Florida. Mm. So they were known as conservative upstarts 15 to 20 years before you ever heard of them. Mm. Somebody knew about them before you knew about them. There's often a conversation in quote unquote Democratic circles or Black political circles on the pipeline, right? Which is really just creating the opportunity. So that's, to that point of really thinking about how do you build the field, right? And if you even look at the conversation right now with the Biden administration and certain folks, their perspectives on he's hiring everybody from Obama world. Well, that's the world that he was in. Those are people who were good at doing things, so he's hiring them, right? And going back to my point about Jesse, and for colored girls who are into politics, which I think everybody, regardless of where you're at on the political spectrum, should read. If you care about Black women, you should read it. If you care about Black politics, you should read it. If you care about Black people, you should read it. But again, these women, Donna Brazile, Minion Moore, Tina Flory, they're back in the game, and they came in the 80s. Mm-hmm. Because they're part of this system of people who were building the field. So that's one thing. To your broader point, again kind of goes back to my point about Black people in the assumption that Black folks think the same, right? One, I think your point about an organizing mentality of, hey man, they getting me down, and then the point of, well, what you gonna do about it? That is a classic organizer perspective. Yeah. Like, how are you going to be part of the solution to your problem? Can I get you to come to this meeting, brother? Can I get you to come to this meeting, sister? Right? And that is part of the Black community's history, right? You've always had socialists and communists that said, hey, man, the man been beating you with his stick. Come to our meetings. So we can keep telling you about the man was beating you with our stick. And they've been Black communists for a long time, right? Mm-hmm. At the same time as Black folks that get real individualistic about the possibilities of change. Mm-hmm. And that is a part of our community too. Yeah. And the idea that you could think that systems conspire to harm you, but that you have individual responsibility, don't have to be at odds. Yeah. And I think our current politics have framed it like that. Yeah. Right? It's like either or. Either the system is all encompassing or it's all on you. When anyone that's gotten out of 9th or 10th grade and read a number of books that should be functional should know that there's a relationship between you and the universe. dealing with supreme mathematics from alphabet, right? So the idea that it's either or is a flawed political concept that has come in vogue, frankly, very recently. Whether I feel like older Black people across the board sometimes are very individualistic, right? I can sit here all day in conversations with Larry Lane talking to him, man, he should have went and got a job. He had to shoot that dude. And, you'd be like, oh, man, there was all these things, man. They locked his brother up. They locked his brother up, man. And, but he didn't have to pull that trigger, right? That is a held perspective by populations to say, yes, even though I understand these systems, that doesn't mean that you have to fall, quote unquote, victim to that system, right? So that is a part of Black people's political economy and thought. And so for when we did that, one, I think that your relationship to his organizing is fascinating, but two, it's a part of the community's kind of space. Now, the other part that, again, and I think, when you watch the tape, I just dated myself when you watch the tape, like we're about to watch WrestleMania or video box.
Like I'm about to bring the tape over. Like I left it with you. You know what I'm saying? When you get your VCR
about to listen to the tape of the father, right? Like when you listen to the tape, but the Otisville tape. But I'm saying, like, so when you watch The Breakfast Club, there's a range of, again, perspectives that they come from. And of course, Charlemagne has kind of taken up the speak truth to power space. And I think Obama gives what is a fascinating and prescient way to explain the political reality of America. That I think because a lot of us aren't involved in national politics, we're involved in local or at best state politics, usually in states where one or two things is happening. Either there's a whole bunch of Black folks who have never gotten their just due. So the question is always, what are you going to do for me? Or you're in a state where there's no Black folks, so you're always behind the eight ball fighting for your just due, right? Because you've never gotten anything.
Right.
And you're saying, what are you going to do? You're not looking at how are you going to interact with Mexican farmers in Iowa, and how are you going to get their vote? And how are you? And one thing the Democratic Party did not do was acknowledge the difference between folks who consider themselves Tejanos at the border of Mexico and indigenous folks or quote unquote Chicanos or folks who are from Mexico in Arizona, and acknowledge that they are entirely different people. The only thing that makes them the same is that they speak the same language. They are not the same. So when you have this national conversation, it brings to bear that from a policy perspective, again, we're dealing with scarcity, right? And the scarcity of ideas and the scarcity of resources and the ability to be able to form coalitions and build power based upon that scarcity, that you have to think about in often the broadest sense of how you produce benefits for people who are harmed. Another thing I'll quickly say about that is I think the idea that we have on a very municipal level and sometimes even a state level of this idea of to whom it has been harmed the most should get the most resources is often not a political statement.
Yeah, it's not.
Right?
It's definitely
it's not a political statement.
It's an academic statement.
It's an academic statement, and it has become a value-based statement and a social statement. And again, working in equity, obviously it makes sense that if you have an economy that's dragging, you have to find a way to get resources to the people who are behind the most, because there's other people who are running with the ball. So you got to bring some other people along. That just makes political sense. But it's different than the statement of the responsibility of government is to help those who have been harmed the most. That becomes a difficult political statement, right? The idea, and I'm not speaking for my particular job here, But the idea of saying that public safety and the police often have a outsized element of resources and needs, and if possible, those resources need to be shifted to things that could minimize troubles in communities so that you would not have to have, are entirely different than the political perception of defund the police. And I'm not debating that concept. I'm just simply saying the rationality of what everyone understands about it is different than the concept of defund the police, which is very political, but politically it is a different and complicated concept to manage. Because there are Black people who don't want to hear that. There are Black people who feel like they want more and better police, that they don't want less of them. They want more of them, but they want them not to beat our heads in, right? So again, I think Obama gave him a really good example of that. But again, much of our political discourse has become academic or activist conversations, which is also due to the failure of the Black political class, right? The Black political class has failed to keep people engaged and involved, and often look like that they have become the Black elite in your respective city. So therefore, you've lost people. You've definitely lost the people, because our voting is usually 20, 30%. So you've lost the vast majority of our people. And you've lost the academics. So,
Well, I think there's something there I want to tap on, because I think that there's a stress factor in sort of like, there's a stress factor for, and I think people who we would maybe consider more grassroots, in the mix, organizing, right? People who may be operating more at the, like, I'm involved in the local and statewide, Democratic, or, Oklahoma, like Tim Scott, or, Republican Party, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
I mean, whatever the parties, right? And so you might be operating in that space. And then if you over here operating in this grassroots space, your construction of like who's legitimate is different. You know what I'm saying? And you may have in one that, when you're maybe, operating at the place where, like, if something, when a Biden gets elected, that your number might get called to go to DC to take a role somewhere, right? Because of how you operate in the state you're in, right? And right. So then you're and you maybe been doing this for years, right? So you there's certain parts of the discussion about public policy and operation that you like, look, I'm not going over there to argue with people about that again. I've been doing this for 20 years. I know what I'm doing, right? And then, and a person that's operating that super grassroots space may have the same perception of in terms of their like legitimacy and how they feel about whose points they're going to like spend time talking about, right? And they'll be like, so they might say, look, we just dealing with organizing and mutual aid, or, figuring out a way to get what we need without, too much of the government or too much of this or too much of that, because I'm tired of talking to those people, and then when I get there, they don't really respect what I got to say, right? Or they're not really responsive. They end up sending me the same ideas or whatever, right? And there's a space in there, where, I would say the person is operating, heavily sort of in the national platform sort of conversation, so to speak, is like, hey man, has anyone done a stress test to make sure that people really are down with this platform beyond the people that are already involved, right? Or like, how do y'all communicate? Like, how do we know? Like you said, well, it's on the website. You can go read it. Like, yeah, dog, but it's a damn political. Like, how there's a lot of regular people that ain't gonna read no whole platform page on the website. You know what I'm saying? And then on the other side of it, looking at that other, and these are two. I'm constructing this conversation around these two groups, and I think it's much more complicated,
nuanced, right?
Nuanced that for the world, but just so we can get to a thought, like, where you go, you can realize sometimes, and quite frankly, be stressed out by our own, like, I was out there, man. We had the thing going, we got the juice thing going, we had the tables out, and we had weekly food deliveries. It was great. And then this happened, and somebody stole the gas out the truck, and then we ain't had no money to get a new truck, so we had to stop the program, right? And you'd be like, fully frustrated. Like, how can someone do that to us, right? And both of these points of frustration are actually experiencing, to me, the same thing. Where you get to the limits of how much whatever activating you're doing can impact the changes that you want. But then also that there's other people that's operating on other ideas that, they may not have been malicious, but they were definitely like, they didn't have regard for how this would impact you. So if you're, the local program you was running to try to change a block or a neighborhood got undermined by some totally random, somebody stole the van, the person whose crib was letting y'all use the crib for organizing passed away, and the kids wasn't down with y'all meeting in the crib no more, so they kicked y'all out the crib. You know what I'm saying? So y'all couldn't do the organizing. Right. Like any of these random, and you could go, well, they should have, they was down for the cause, they should have gave us the building. Like, well, yeah, they should have, but they didn't. Like, and then on the other side, we're like, yeah, I was doing all this work, man. I got the program policy into the platform for the state, man, and the state said they was gonna give me the money. And then when I came down to the neighborhood and said, I got the thing, I only got 3 applicants. And since I ain't get no more applicants, they decided not to refund it when the budget got low on the next year. And everybody missed out on this cool, fantastic, life-changing platform. This is the same thing, which is deals with the relationship, not just between your ideas, but also the people whom you are targeting those ideas to.
Right. Who you purport to serve and the larger challenge. And I think that's also, again, with this transition, I think Obama, in a couple different ways, in some senses, is one of the people at the end of an era. Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
We've often talked about, and anyone that has spent probably more than 20 minutes with me knows my respect for the Chicago political reality. It's just what happens there. But also, again, and I think it's important when we think about him and frame his experience. He was in a city that was and still is, to some degree, 1/3 Black, well, was more than 1/3 Black at that time, white and Latino. Mm-hmm. That there was no majority population, right? Mm-hmm. And the politics of being in a city where there's no majority population is different than being in different cities. Mm-hmm. It's different than being in a city where Black folks are 10 or 12 or even 20%. It means being in a city where Black folks are 35% of the population. It means you can do whatever you want in your part of the neighborhood. But if you want something to move past your neighborhood, you have to create a coalition. Mm-hmm. When we speak about, Harold Washington and the high regard that so many of us have for him, we forget that the activists who were around Harold Washington were angry at him, and some of them never spoke to him again because of the deals he cut when he was in office. So I want to say, when you look at Barack Obama and frame his political history and background, mm-hmm. you have to put Chicago into context. You have to put Hyde Park, which is right by the University of Chicago, with the white folks who always been fighting against the other white folks, right? Mm-hmm. Into context. Even today, when we look at Hyde Park as one of the few diverse Chicago neighborhoods in the sense of Black and white in Chicago, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. right? I mean, so when you want to frame this conversation, you have to frame what is this person's political context, right? And how you do that. So to go from there to then win as a senator in Illinois, which means you have to win all of what's going on in Chicago, and you have to get some votes in some really strange places, right?
Yeah.
You just like you got to, if you want to be a U.S. senator in Oregon, I mean, you got to go to some pretty far places to get some votes, right? From some people that you ain't used to being around all the time. Again, by the nature of it, you're creating a coalition. So when people whose framework about how they're being Black runs into the context of how they are a Black person who wants to build power and has to use this means to build power, that's a different stress test, to your point. Mm-hmm. One thing I will say about the idea of, quote unquote, defund the police, there's not a political slogan. And one of the issues with the Democratic Party is that it got conflated and elected, like let it become conflated. Mm-hmm. So activists are going to press a system. Organizers are going to press a system. It's the nature of what they should be doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're not doing it to be cool with you. They're doing it to advance an interest, just like all other interest groups. And that's how you should treat it. Mm-hmm. What happens is we go past it and say, well, the activist said it, so it must be truth. And then elected officials are in varying states of what do I do about this statement? Versus you should have had a perspective on how to engage police and how to get resources to communities before my man got killed in Minneapolis.
Right. Right.
Right. That, again, sometimes the limitation of Black politics, right? You should have already figured that out. So you shouldn't have had to adjust because that was just an issue and a challenge that your community had. So when we start to talk about how, again, a person who was the president of the entire United States of America figured out and understood and what he had to say, you should put that context into it before the conversation starts, right? It's almost like talking to somebody about their child. It's a pretty good chance they're not, if their child can't play basketball, it's a pretty good chance they're not going to tell people outside the house that their child is a bum. It's a pretty good chance they're going to say, well, you know, he just got into it. Yeah, she just got into it.
Yeah, he just went out for the team. We didn't even know. He just went out for the team and
the trajectory so far has been really fascinating, right? They're not going to be like, my child's a bum, right? Like, because you're just not going to say that about your child in their face that they can't play basketball. So my point is, at the same time, when this person was in office, the limitations that they had, again, with our political sophistication, that should be built in. You should understand the limitations of that built in, right? You shouldn't be having to think about, like, is this person going to say that? What you should be thinking about is, how do we get what we need, right? But then again, it goes back to the organizing in the communal space of, what do we need and how have I been in relationship, and use one of your lines, how have I been in relationship with people I don't agree with, but we Black. And right. if we want good things for Black people, I had to be in relationship with them to know how we can work together to do that. So I think the interview, I mean, I haven't gotten the book either, just because I know that even reading an excerpt, it felt like I was in college again. So I can only reading at 500 pages of that shit, man. I'm at the,
I think it's 700. I think it's 7.
That's what I'm saying. My man wrote 700 pages and he got another one dropping. Like, you know what I mean? It's like a mixtape where, like the Bird Gang and Jim Jones used to do the mixtapes. You'd be like, it's 30 songs on the mixtape. Like,
how you do 30 songs? How do I even listen to 30 songs?
It's 32 minutes. It's 32-minute songs on the mixtape, right? And they got 5 versions. They got five episodes. Like Diplomats used to do that. I got all those goddamn songs, man. But so my point is, he has that level of conversation. I have to be ready and not be reading any other book when you want to get into that kind of space. But it also is a testament to, I mean, frankly, the power of the Breakfast Club at being a place where, they are influencers in the conversation, and not just young Black America, but just young America, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's actually, there's a tip of the hat to them that, I in terms of, I don't know what other media outlets that aren't like a news channel would be considered as like a source to document the moment that you have to go to as Barack Obama releasing a book right now. And anybody, like right now, I don't know who, the other, there's the Rick Smiley of the world, in terms of like places that I would say are definitely more like, you would say that like you're definitely going there to reach Black people, where I think with the Breakfast Club, you're going there to reach maybe a broader demographic than just Black people. You know what I'm saying? I think you're going to a demographic that is, a certain age and maybe a certain orientation, but it's not just like, just Ricky Smiley, if you ever listen to the Rajee podcast, I appreciate what you do out there. I hope you don't take that as a slight in any way, but I know you speak to a particular connection with the South that is important, right? But I don't think that anyone who came to your show would also be thinking they might connect with somebody who happens to like hip hop music and culture, but is from, you name it, upstate New York or California or Nevada or wherever in America, where I think the Breakfast Club and, maybe their demographics will say otherwise, but they definitely have a national footprint, you know what I'm saying, in terms of if you on their platform, then that's who's listening, you know what I'm saying? And good for them, you know what I'm saying? Like, media is important, you know what I mean? But word to Big Bird. So I think we could call it there.
Yeah, man. No, I mean, I just think, I think, to your point, making this through line is a really important part of a dialogue, a long-term dialogue that Black folks need to have. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I'll say is that we cannot be on 4-year processes for our political conversation. And even if you look at, again, from New York City with Dinkins to Chicago with Harold Washington to Philadelphia with Wilson Good to DC with Walter Washington before Marion Barry, because sometimes we forget there was a Black mayor in DC before Marion Barry. He was so big of a personality. I'll just say that you forget that there was another brother that was actually mayor. But those were long-term projects, right? So if you're talking about Black organizing, if you're talking about being in relationship with people who have different perspectives, that's a long-term project, and it is not determined by when the money hits the streets. It's not determined by when labor or rich people who are usually white, but not always, put money on the street to have a political conversation. We have to be in relationship around this conversation perpetually if we want that through line not to continue on, right? Of somebody came to pass, we didn't understand the politics of the time. We look back on it and say they did a good job, but it doesn't matter because we still haven't built the relationships we need to continually serve ourselves and build Black agency. Mm-hmm. Right? I just want to say this, and I'm done. The Black lives have always mattered. Mm. Black lives mattering is for white people in the sense of what people are broadly saying.
Right.
We have to have a term of building agency and self-sufficiency and leverage and power in our communities as a broader political statement. Peace.
One thing I will add is when we think about change and societal change and even systemic change, that if the rules, practices, and norms, incentives, and penalties still benefit the system that disenfranchised you already, you can't just inject money or anything into it and then think now it's different. The rules, the practices, the norms, the incentives, and the penalties also need to change. So with that, hold that. Peace.
My man, peace.
Thank you for listening to Good Brothers. Thank you to my good brother, Majestic. Good Brothers is a podcast that is a part of Ask Your Oldhead Podcast. And it's a special conversations between me and my good brother, Majestic, and sometimes other guests. You can support the podcast by listening, sharing, rating, and subscribe. Wherever podcasts can be found, you can find Ask Your Oldhead and Good Brothers, and more to come in the coming year. In light of all that's going on in the world, I hope that you found something useful in our dialogue. And as always, take the best part for yourself. I want to give a special thanks and musical considerations to my man, Black Man Green Plan, Knowledge Divine. I want to give a shout out to all of the healthcare workers who's out here trying to keep people upright and healthy and to recover as we continue to exist and operate within this public health crisis. Please be safe. Please make good decisions. And if you're not sure, ask for help. There's a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of things going on to try to help people, despite what you may have heard, from your mans and them. So, still much more to be done on that note. But anyway, I'm not here for that. So, as always, take the best part for yourself. Thank you for listening. Peace.